Good morning. We are very pleased to see you all this morning. My name is Deborah Owens, and I'm the chair of the Education, Equipping, and Empowering Committee of the Presbytery, and we are pleased that you have decided to join us this morning in an exploration of God's Word in God's land. And as we get started, I have a little bit of information for you and some instructions for you, and then we're going to pray and get started. So the information, if you haven't discovered it yet, there is coffee and refreshments right outside the door, and there are restrooms in the back to my right, my left, your right, and there are next to or across from the sign-in table some index cards, which will become more meaningful as we move along. But the index cards are an opportunity for you to write down questions that may come up for you during this time. After the presentations this morning, we'll have a chance to speak with our panel and to respond to questions. To give you an idea of what's happening, we will have presentations first from Dr. Dennis Olcom, and then from Dr. Tommy Givens, and then after a break in between, and after the last break, we will have Dr. Marianne May Thompson moderate a panel discussion with our guest speakers. There'll be a little bit more in between, but that's a general idea. We also have resources available for you, but the ticket for the resources is an evaluation. So we have a short evaluation form that we would appreciate you filling out before you leave to give us some feedback. We want to know if this opportunity to have this conversation about what the Bible says about Israel and Palestine, especially at this moment in our history, was useful to you, and if you'd like more opportunities to have such conversations or to deepen your knowledge and understanding. So we'll ask for some feedback from you and also share some resources that our panelists have put together for you all. And with that, I think we are ready to get started. So please pray with me. Gracious Father, we thank you for this morning, for this opportunity to come together in your name yet again. We come together with our hearts and minds joined because we have an interest in understanding what's going on in Israel and Palestine, but also what's going on in our world altogether. We hope that as you are with us, that we are able to open our minds and to discern your will, to deepen our knowledge and to find the place where our heart rests and as we struggle with these issues individually and within our communities and congregations. We ask that you be with us all. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. And Tiffany Ashworth will come up to introduce.
Hello, hello. If everyone could find your way back to a seat, that would be great. All right. So I am Dennis. Seriously, man. Just kidding. All right. So I'm Jess Wong. I'm also part of the EEE committee, the Triple E. And I have the honor of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Tommy Givens. So Dr. Givens is an associate professor of New Testament and Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he teaches both master's and doctoral students. And he writes on the New Testament, obviously, as well as political theory, Christian nonviolence, and ecology. He is the author of We the People, Israel, and the Catholicity of Jesus, so that's why we invited him. Thank you, Tommy. And he has two forthcoming publications, Lost in the Bible. This book is an intervention, and a commentary on the book of Matthew's, Light in the Shadow of Death. So we are so thrilled to have Tommy with us, and we are expecting a brilliant talk, no pressure.
So I have a lot of the same background as Dennis, growing up in similar sort of Christian denomination and array of different Christian traditions. Someone was just telling me I'm a Christian mutt with all the different denominations that I belong to. But I haven't been Presbyterian long enough to know that I should write everything down. So this might get out there and I'll just have to live with it. That'll be okay. I want to focus my time with you on the language of the Bible, specifically how the word, the name Israel seems to work in the Bible, and hopefully to give us some guidance for how we're going to draw from the Bible in the way that we imagine and engage whatever we understand the reality of Israel to be today. Part of my purpose, just to state it up front, is to question the way that the modern state of Israel has come to monopolize in our minds the meaning of the word Israel. At the same time, though, I want to avoid, I think, what is a Christian tendency to effectively delegitimize the Jewish claim to the name of Israel as well as the land of Israel. So I have a lot of sympathies with Dennis's presentation about the need to question the way that a particular Jewish presence that has nationalized and laid claim to this land in the Middle East has meant great harm for the local Palestinian population, something that I do not think Christians should abide or support. But in the way that we offer criticism of that, which I certainly want to encourage, don't want us to be oblivious to some of the ways that the Jewish community and what it has endured has found itself wanting to lay such a strong claim to that particular land with the sort of presence that it has now. So that's just kind of a guide for where I'm going. But as I said, what I really want to do with us as Christians is to talk about where in the Bible we can learn what the sort of meaning of this prestigious term, Israel, is, and hopefully begin to use that term, imagine what it is about more judiciously, especially in the way that we live as Christians. So that's what I'm up to. Am I supposed to use a button of some kind to advance the slides? I probably am. Okay. I didn't do any prep for this part, so let's see if I mess this up. There we go. So, first idea I'd like to discuss here with you is understanding Israel in the Bible as an intergenerational people. A people with a particular beginning in the world that then unfolds over time with generations of certain names. You'll be familiar with their foundational generations. We often hear about the God of Israel as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And the early parts of the book of Genesis tell us how from this wandering Aramean, God began to weave together a family over generations, starting with Abraham and Sarah, then Rebekah and Isaac, then Jacob with 4 wives, Leah, her maidservant Zilpah, Rachel, her slave, Bilhah. Out of these generations, we begin to see this unfolding sprawl of the people of Israel. There's one feature of this family, though, that I want to highlight from the very beginning. And it is that being born into the family does not mean that one will have a future in the family. So Abraham had more than one son. You remember Abraham had both Isaac and Ishmael. And the future of Ishmael, even though Ishmael comes from Abraham, does not weave over generations into the future of Israel. It becomes a different community with a different name and a different memory. The same happens with the next generation with Jacob, and you remember his brother's name? Esau, who is the father of the Edomites in the memory of the Bible. And so simply coming from Isaac, as Jacob does not mean that Esau develops a future over generations in what we call the family of Israel, which is the promised family of Abraham. So we'll often hear people talk about Israel in the Bible as if it were simply a matter of physically descending from Abraham. So I just want to state categorically, that's just not true. It's not true to what Israel is in the Bible. It's not merely being born into the family, because over generations, there's a lot of drama. And some streams of the community weave out of the future and into other peoples, and others maintain that memory of belonging over generations to this promised family of Israel. Now, by the same token, something that many people don't often observe about this people of Israel as an intergenerational people is that it is adopting people from beyond those who are born into the household from the very beginning. You all might remember the commands that Abraham is given with circumcision in Genesis 17, explicitly instructing Abraham to circumcise not only the males that are born into his household to be heirs of his name, his patrimony, his land, etc., but also others, slaves, captives, others who find their way into Abraham's name and family are to be adopted into the family through, in Genesis 17, specifically the ritual of circumcision and all that that entails. So it's an intergenerational people, but it's not a people that's restricted to some kind of genetic purity. It's not merely a bloodline. Have many people that are born into the family who over generations find that their future leads out of the family. Meanwhile, others who are born into other peoples find themselves adopted into the family. So that's how Israel is presented to us broadly in the Old Testament as this intergenerational people. By birth, by adoption, and by much more. Part of the reason I say much more here is there is a tendency I find, especially in our generation, to think of people over generations with what you might call a kind of genetic or biological determinism. I mean, this is especially happening now with the fascination we have with learning our genetic history and thinking that this is sort of definitive of who we are. The Bible is especially mindful that human beings, bodily, physically, over time, are made up of far more than their genes. They're made up of their relationships, how they relate to land, the food that they eat, the experiences that they endure. All of this shapes which relationships coalesce over time and what shape people's lives and communities' lives take over generations. And so it's not in the Bible really possible to make sense of Israel or any other community on the earth, for example, simply in terms of drawing some kind of genetic line from generation to generation. The intergenerational nature of the people is a manifold drama. It builds that people over time. One other key characteristic that I think Christians especially need to observe about the Israel that we meet in the Bible, this is already evident in what we've seen in those foundational generations, is that Israel is not made up of only people who get things right, who believe the right things about God, or who are obedient to God. We're all familiar with the wild drama of Israel that we get in the Bible. And it's quite clear that Israel is treated as Israel when Israel is disobeying God. God doesn't suddenly categorize Israel as some other people because they fail to obey or fail to believe. They remain who they are by God's grace, sustained in all kinds of ways, even when they are unfaithful to the covenant that they have with God. So this is important because there's a tendency, I think, especially in the Christian tradition, frankly, to idealize Israel, to treat it as people that meet some standard, people that meet a certain criterion, people, for example, that believe the right things. And the Israel that I find in the Bible just doesn't yield to that way of presenting it or understanding it. Even when Israel is bad, it's still Israel. So that's somehow got to inform how we're going to think of how the Bible talks about the people of God as Israel. Among the other things that I've already described as constituting Israel over time, they're shaped by decisive activities of God in their memory. Israel finds itself driven down into Egypt by famine from the generation of Jacob on. You all remember the story of Joseph at the end of Genesis. And what plays a decisive role in constituting who this people is later, generations after being enslaved in Egypt, is God's saving this people from Egypt. So this is a decisive marker of who this people is, and part of that being saved by this God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, is receiving a law that enshrines their memory, their hope, gives them commands that form them over generations, whether they obey them or they disobey them. So these are all key ingredients to who the people of Israel is in the Bible. It's crucial here to keep in mind that the law itself entails what unfolds from it in our Bible, in the prophets and the writings and then the New Testament, and that is memory. It enshrines the memory of the people that they are not to forget. And it also includes hope. There's a vision for what Israel is called to be on the earth, what their relationships will grow to be like with other peoples of the earth over time. So this is really key to who Israel is in the Bible, is this entire dramatic story of the people rather than just one definition or one criterion or category. Memory and hope. You'll see this is going to become important as we get a little deeper into the New Testament and then try to make sense of what's happening with memory and hope in the Middle East today. I've already signaled that the way that the drama of Israel unfolds over generations is not characterized by any neat line of continuity. The people divides. We've talked about the division between Jacob and Esau, for example, Israel and the Edomites. Later on in its generations, once Israel has reestablished itself as 12 tribes in this promised land, they divide again. If you remember, under King Jeroboam, the kingdom of Israel is divided into two, a kingdom in the north and a kingdom in the south. And eventually that kingdom in the north is invaded by Assyria and dispersed, so that over the subsequent generations, many of those tribes of the north, if you remember names like Ephraim, Simeon, Gad, Manasseh, Reuben, these tribes go extinct. They are totally assimilated by other peoples. They maintain no memory, no living memory in the people of Israel. All that is left, the only remnant of the people, is Judah and Benjamin in the south, that are what's left of the kingdom of Judah. And we know that some of those northern tribes, as they were being assimilated by others, actually got regrafted into those two southern tribes of the kingdom of Judah. So this is just part of the story of who Israel is: division, assimilation by other peoples, but adopting other peoples into what remains of Israel over time as well. This means that to be Israel in the Bible is to be a people in conflict. It's not to be a people where everybody agrees, where everybody has the same beliefs. It's an uneasily shared life. You remember we find in the New Testament there are two communities of the memory of Israel that are still alive: Jews and Samaritans. And they are not enjoying an easily shared life. They experience various kinds of hostility with one another, even as they share the memory, the life, the hope of the people of Israel. So I hope there's one thing that's come through already. There's a tendency in our time to think that Israel is synonymous with Jews. But this is just not true in the Bible. The Jewish community would be one stream that emerges over time from this dramatic history of Israel, along with others. So hopefully that's something that will just enrich and maybe complicate a little bit how we're thinking about who Israel is according to the Bible. Now, we know ourselves here gathered, I assume most of us today, as Christian. And one of our challenges in some of the great presentation that Dennis has given us with the theological traditions of our faith is how to make sense of our life as the Christian church in relation to this dramatic history of the people of Israel. And I have to tell you, I'm not sure I've got any straightforward answers for you about this. And I sometimes worry that if we have a straightforward answer, we're not really being patient with frankly, the messiness of the history and hope of the people of Israel that we get in the Bible. But broadly speaking, it seems to me, and Dennis has already signaled this in his presentation, that in the New Testament we're taught that people who embrace Jesus as the Lord, as the Messiah, from among the Gentile peoples, find themselves adopted into this promised family of Abraham, and in that sense would be appropriately known as Israel. The challenge, I think, arises when Christians have found ourselves inferring from that we're therefore entitled to disinherit other people who are already part of the family because we think that we've met some criterion, like believing in Jesus as the Messiah or something like that. That doesn't seem to me to line up with what we get in the New Testament. So, in the New Testament, what I find is still an uneasily shared life of the people of Israel. This would be Jewish Christians, it would be Jewish non-Christians, it would be Christians of all kinds of different backgrounds, slowly being adopted, you might say, into this dramatic history, this memory, with this hope, for Christians now guided by Jesus as the key figure that holds this memory and hope together. But part of the key of what we find with Jesus himself in the New Testament is that Jesus does not seem to come into the picture and disown his people, even those who reject him. Instead, he says that he has come for all of his people, without disowning any of the sheep, searching for every last one of them, which is exactly the hope of the prophets. And so it seems to me that for a Christian without a Jewish background to follow Jesus is to see ourselves called to refuse to disown any of the family of the earth who calls out to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as their God, however inadequately we might think that they do that. That to me is what it means to follow Jesus as part of this history, family, hope of Israel. Now we get a little more complicated, maybe. Was this complicated enough already? Probably was. Okay, if I lost you, we're now going to talk about how you can't make sense of this intergenerational people, as I've just tried to summarize it for you, apart from land. One of the challenges with this, I think, for us in our time is that we naively imagine that human beings can live sustainably without land. We think that food comes from stores, that you get it with just money. This is not actually how humanity works. Humanity, for its sustainability, depends on a certain way of relating to land and non-human animals. And this is something the Bible is not naive about. So from the very beginning, the picture of the human is one that is in dynamic and intimate relationship with land. The health, the hope, the memory of the human, of any human community, is therefore deeply and intricately tied to land. And we find that with the story of Israel from its very beginning. So you'll remember when God calls Abram from Abram of Ur, calls out to Abram when Abram is already migrating across the top of the Fertile Crescent, come up through Mesopotamia, he's in Haran, and God calls to Abraham and says that I will take you to a land and make of you a great people, and in you bless all the peoples of the world. So from the beginning, Abram is told, to your offspring I will give this land of Canaan. This is reiterated again and again and again. All the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Rise up, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. Just giving you some tidbits here from the inaugural moment of the story. Now, the borders of the land, I would say, are not given the way that we're accustomed to hearing about borders today. Those of us who are maybe accustomed to visiting Mexico, crossing Canada, think that a border is a neat line in the earth where you hand your passport over and you've crossed from one end to the other. When you think about land in a more agrarian way, you tend to divide land more according to rivers, watersheds, the more natural ways that human beings draw upon land for their life. And so the borders of the land are not as defined in the Bible as we might be accustomed or what we would expect. But if we try to draw a line, which is probably never a good idea, you might draw a line that looks something like this. The language that's used is from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. This is the land of Canaan, the western part of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. It's a highly desirable land because of the way that it is watered, the kind of sustainability of human beings there. It's a land of milk and honey, you remember from the story of Exodus. So this is, broadly speaking, the most immediate tract of land that is promised to Abram and to his offspring. Now, can you imagine already how complicated the picture of land is going to be with what we've said about Israel? Like, which part of Abraham's manifold family gets to lay claim to this? That's a hard line to draw. And I do want to speak directly against Netanyahu that there's no easy deed in the Bible for the Israel that Netanyahu imagines as somehow entitled to own and control and possess this land. The picture of Israel is simply too messy to be drawing some easy deed from it in that sense from the Bible. But just so we're not thinking too amorphously, too ambiguously about the land, this is maybe a working picture that we could have. Here's how the land begins to come into Abraham's possession. I worry about that word, by the way. I'm not sure possession in the Bible means what we often think it means today. So mark that for the Q&A. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it and all the trees that were in the field throughout the whole area, passed to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, in the presence of all who went in at the gate of his city. Why did Abraham negotiate the purchase of this small field of land in Canaan that had been promised to him? To bury his wife. The only piece of land that Abraham has when he dies is enough to have a tomb. So the whole future of Israel is pregnant in a way in Abraham's life, but very humbly. And how does Abraham come into possession of this land from the Hittites? There's no conquest. There's no displacing people. It's a very delicate ritual. If you read this in Genesis 23, there's full of mutual respect between Abraham and the local inhabitants, and an arrangement that will leave a positive and life-giving memory of how this land has come into Abraham's name and future. What I want to emphasize here is that rather than it's being given as something that is handed over through massive violence or something like that, which we often will associate with the book of Joshua, and we can come back to that, it begins as something that Abraham very carefully comes to hold for his family and for his future in a respectful negotiation with the local inhabitants. Might be a model for us to think about the way that Israel might enjoy this land. You remember the story that I've already hinted at with the intergenerational tale of Israel, that in the generation of Jacob, they are driven down to Egypt because of famine. And when Jacob is dying, just to give you a glimpse of the significance of this promised land to these people, here's what we learn. Jacob insists with Joseph that he not allow his bones to remain in Egypt, but that somehow, some way, he's got to take dead Jacob with him all the way back to this land to be buried in that promised land. So the memory, the hope of this community is tied inextricably to this particular place. Being buried anywhere is not going to be okay. The fact that Jacob, in retrospect, we might say, is going to be raised from the dead one day in a new creation does not somehow render meaningless the particular places, the particular words, the promises that have governed his life and his hope. So we got to keep in mind that some hope for ultimate renewal or ultimate healing doesn't simply eliminate the attachments that people have to particular places, their names, the ties of their relationships to those places. Here's a feature of the Bible when it comes to Israel in relation to land that I find sorely neglected in conversations today about Israel in relation especially to the Promised Land. And it is that Israel manifestly does not enjoy possession of the land, presence in the land unconditionally. No. It's painfully clear that Israel's ability to enjoy the land over generations and to be at peace there depends on how they live there. This is because the land is holy. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I also dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites. So for this place, with this intense memory and hope, to be the theater of the mistreatment of people or the mistreatment of land, courts disaster. It courts all kinds of consequences. And there are specific ways in which Israel is told that it must live in this land if it is going to find that it is able to live there over generations in peace. Probably the most obvious one is the Sabbath. The land is to be cared for. It is to be given rest. It's not to be exploited. It's not about maximizing profit. It's about nurture. If you nurture this land, giving it its rest over time, then you're investing in a future of being able to dwell in this land in peace. If you exploit this land, if you take advantage of it, then, as this passage in the law says, you can expect to be driven out of it so that you will not enjoy living there. This extends not only to how they treat land, but how they treat foreigners, how they treat other vulnerable people. In general, you might say the quality of their society, the way that they're able to share with one another, is what promotes or discourages the future of being able to enjoy living in this place. Now, I'm sure where a bunch of your minds are going, as it should be, is that the way that the state of Israel today is treating the land and treating the people is courting disaster. I think that is true. But I hesitate to emphasize it in this setting because I think some of the ways that we're living in our land, in our place, is courting disaster. And I worry about the tendency to focus our criticism on something that gains a lot of attention for various reasons to the neglect of how we're living in our place. What God is teaching this generation of Israel in the past is also teaching to us about how we live in the places we've found ourselves. We all know that we've come to live in this part of the world through all kinds of very ugly history that it is crucial to be truthful about. But we continue to have inherited habits of living in this place, habits of treating one another, exploiting land, people, etc., that court disaster. So the same contingency that affects this historic people of Israel and the way that they live in the land of Canaan affects us today. And if we think that we're going to have anything critical to say about how people are living in the Middle East and whether or not they're going to get to stay there, the only authority it's going to have is if it flows from self-examination of ourselves and the way we're living in our place. So I just want to make that note so that we're not jumping hypocritically to target other people and not training that criticism on ourselves. So the way that Israel lives in the land conditionally rather than unconditionally gives rise to a tradition, a Jewish tradition over many generations that I would say today is all but lost. And that is dread of the land. You find this among many rabbinic teachers, and there's one sliver of Israeli Jews today that have maintained this tradition. And I don't think it's incidental who they are. It's Israeli poets. Israeli poets give words to the way that enjoying the land that they live is not a guarantee. That whatever promise from God might attach to it, what comes with it as well is all kinds of vulnerability, all kinds of difficulty. And so they're trying to remind their people by way of poetry that to know the land is to know a certain dread of the land. There is an intensity of memory. There is an intensity of hope that concentrates in this particular place, so that it might be better, some rabbis begin to teach, for Israel, scattered around the world, not to live there at all. We might have a better chance at surviving and thriving in the world if we don't live in that particular land. So, a dimension of Israel's history that I think has been lost, and this is an article that was published by Avisa Ravitsky. Can a holy land also be a homeland in a land adored yet feared? 2008. So here's someone today who's still saying our attachment to this place and thinking that we own it and get to live however we want on it is neglecting dread of the land that we need to learn from our ancestors. So Tiffany had a few questions that were up there that I thought it would be good for me to say something about before we go to Q&A. These are not going to be adequate answers to these questions. I think the first thing that I just want to make sure, hopefully, that you've gotten from this point to this point and what I've had to say is that it is, I think, a mistake to simply assume that the Jews of the modern state of Israel are Israel in the Bible. Matters are more complex than that. So to think of Israeli and Israelite as the same thing is just not going to be true to the Bible. Many folks today, and we'll see this in a minute, tend to imagine that Jews, from when we're reading about them in the Bible, sort of remained relatively stable in that region and then constituted a new country, a nation state in 1948. This is manifestly not true. So what many people are not often keeping in mind is that the diaspora, the dispersion of Jewish people over the generations had scattered them across many of the places of the earth. So that to be a Jew was not always to be an Israeli. That only became possible in the 20th century. For a long time, Jews were Arabs, for example. Some still are. Jews were Argentinian. Jews, we have, of course, 6 or 7 million that live in the United States today. Jews are Ethiopian. So Jews have lived and made homes and communities and languages and belonging in many, many places of the world. And it's only in the 19th and then especially in the 20th century that Jews from all of those places have begun to concentrate in the Middle East in what has now become the country, the nation state of Israel. So just keep in mind that history. So how does the Israel of Scripture relate to the modern day state of Israel? Is a question that Tiffany had asked. And this is something we haven't talked about yet, but that I think has to be mentioned in this context. The drive for Jews to regather into this ancient homeland, starting in the 19th century, and then especially in the 20th century, owes a great deal to the hostility that they had experienced from Christians like us. Pogroms, persecution, economic oppression, all kinds of difficulty, danger that Jews experienced over generations, and then, of course, finally the Shoah, the Holocaust, the threat of total genocide, losing 6 million of their number in a period of 6 years. That trauma, any discussion of how Jews feel about the state of Israel today, that trauma has got to be named. Most of us don't think about the place where we live against the fear of eradication, but that is very near to the mind of Jewish people today. Now, as I'm going to go on to say, nothing about that sort of trauma should justify continuing to re-traumatize and oppress other people. But if we think we're going to address the way Jews inhabit and relate to the land of Israel today without accounting for the Shoah, I think we're fools. So we got to keep that key consideration in mind, especially for any conversation that we're having with our Jewish friends, but I hope also with one another. So as I've described, a sizable part of the worldwide Jewish community spread all around the world has now constituted a modern nation state that we call Israel. And somehow we're going to have to reckon with that fact in this messy history of what Israel is as the promised family of Abraham in the Bible. But I just don't want us to equate this relatively recent development geopolitically in the Middle East with what Israel is across now 3,000 plus years. That drama is much broader, and somehow we have to try to make sense of the development of this modern sort of endeavor in statecraft that some Jews, and not all Jews, have undertaken as a state called Israel. So, second question that I got was, what role does Israel play in Jesus' return and the end times? I was tempted to be sort of snarky and say none. Because I don't think there's any obvious yes answer to how this works. But I will just say this, that we find in the New Testament a kind of convergence of several themes throughout the Bible. Paul teaches this specifically in Romans, of the unification of all the people of God, this whole promised family of Abraham, regathering of Israel to the land. This is the same epistle, however, in which Paul is now talking about Abraham's inheritance, not just as Canaan, but as the entire world. So it seems that Paul, for at least among the writers of the New Testament, has a very expansive notion of those boundaries of Israel. So the one thing we could say, I think, as we think about a future that we're working towards, is that it's got to be a future in which the people of God are united across our historic divisions, and something that we're working towards as a community, and doing that in the name of Jesus. It takes seriously this particular land of what we call Israel, but it doesn't separate that land from the other lands of the world. It knows the other lands of the world in relation to this land, in the same way that you know the land of Israel in relation to Jerusalem, for example, in the Bible. And of course, specifically, this is associated by Paul in Romans 11 with the resurrection of all the dead. So that would be one way to try to think about Israel in relation to the future, but I can't think of any way that that specifically has something to do with the modern nation state of Israel. How should we view the conflict in the Middle East through a biblical lens? Wow, I'm already at 38 minutes, so we're not going to do much on this, but we can come back to this in the Q&A. I just hope that one thing you've gotten from this presentation is we want to be wary of using the Bible to just erase people. To think that the Israel of the Bible is the Jewish Israel of the modern nation state of Israel, so that we give no presence, no mindfulness to Palestinians, whether they're Christians like us or Muslims or others, would be a terrible way, I think, to use the Bible. So I hope we're learning to not use the Bible as a weapon of erasure, where we effectively eviscerate the memory, the presence, the body, the hopes of all kinds of people that are tied to this particular land, and of course the conflict that's unfolding there. Combining humility with the pursuit of justice for those being displaced, killed, or treated as collateral. Maybe we can get a little deeper into this in the Q&A. But I started with humility because I do worry about the way that people are so vigorously invested in conflict in the Middle East. And don't get me wrong, I think we should be speaking categorically against the mass killing of Gazans as that's happening today. But an obsession with it that, to me, makes me wonder about whether or not we're adequately obsessed with what is going on in our own places where we're living. It sometimes feels like what I used to experience as a missionary, where churches get very excited about exciting work they're doing far away and don't seem to be nearly as invested in the difficult, slow work in their own town. So just want to caution us on that with the need for humility. I don't think the oppression of Palestinians is justified. I think it must be opposed. We have all kinds of biblical warrants for that. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But I think the fear of Israeli and other Jews in our day today has to be addressed. I think simply setting that fear aside will not lead to any peace in the Middle East or anywhere else. We'll talk about that more in the other one. I think that's enough from me. Thanks for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Givens, for that lecture. So we are going to take another break. Again, the restrooms are in the back, and there's coffee and tea and refreshments outside. Please keep hot beverages outside of the sanctuary, just for cleanliness. We'll drink those out in the narthex or out on the patio. And yes, the Q&A cards, if you have those, we're going to have a couple of our committee members come down the aisle with baskets so you can put those in if you're ready to in the next minute or two. And then the baskets, after they come down the aisle and collect, will be out in the back. If you still need time to write down your question and put your card in the basket in the back during the break, you'll find them back there. I have a question that I need to hurry up and write down for the panel, too. So we are early. We're ahead of schedule, which is kind of unusual at events like this. So we're going to have our break end at 11:05 rather than 11:10. So it's still going to be approximately 10 minutes. So I believe that's it from me. So see you back here for the panel and Q&A time with our speakers and the moderator at 11:05. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I've been asked to, reconvene us as well as introduce our panel, and in particular, the Reverend Dr. Mary Ann Mai Thompson. And for this time, since this next phase is going to be a Q&A with the panel, I'll actually invite Mary Ann together with Dennis and Tommy to come forward and grab a chair for this next portion, and I believe you all do have wireless mics, which is great. My name is Matthew Caldwell. It is an honor to be on the ministry staff of this church, to have been senior pastor here for 17 years, and especially to be able to be one of the hosts of this event. It's hard for me to think of a more timely topic for the church, both locally and broadly speaking, to be tackling, and thrilled with the way that this event has been planned, and especially want to lift up a big thanks to Tiffany, to Jess, to Deborah, Helen, Angelica, and all those who have been a part of putting this event together. Let me now introduce our moderator for the panel, Mary Ann Mai Thompson. Mary Ann has served for years as the George Eldon Ladd Professor of New Testament. She joined the School of Theology faculty back in 1985 and has been instrumental in developing advanced-level interdisciplinary courses that integrate biblical interpretation with other disciplines of the theological curriculum. She's the author of a number of commentaries, including John, a commentary on 1st through 3rd John, a commentary on Colossians and Philemon, and then books such as The God of the Gospel of John, and The Promise of the Father. She's also co-author of Introducing the New Testament, and she's published a host of articles and reviews in scholarly journals. She also served as the Dean of the School of Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's been a member of the Studiorium Novae Testamentis Societas, and participated in various projects at the Center of Theological Inquiry, including the Scripture Project and the Identity of Jesus. She's served on various editorial boards, including Theology Today and New Testament Studies. That's some of her scholarly background. But now, as the person who's blessed to be church with her in a local congregational level, let me just speak briefly to her commitment not just to biblical and theological scholarship, but to the church. And by the church, I mean, we're all Presbyterian, or many of us are Presbyterians here. I mean both the local church. Mary Ann has been very active at La Cañada Presbyterian Church, and in the last 2 decades here at Knox Presbyterian Church, teaching, preaching, be a part of our congregation's journey in an active and vital way. She's also been very active as a member of the Presbytery of San Fernando, being a part of their life together, as well as being engaged in denominational issues. She cares deeply, not just about scholarship, but of the Church of Jesus Christ. And it's always, what I've learned too as a preacher, is it's really important for me to have read her commentaries before I preach on the book of the Bible. If not, I can picture her right there going, oh. And you think I'm kidding, I'm not. So, having introduced our moderator, let me now turn the floor over to Mary Ann, as well as to Dennis and Tommy. And thank you all so much again for being here today.
Thank you, and thank you for your questions. There are many, and none of them is easy. So what I'm going to try to do is to group them into categories, and if we don't actually read out your question as it's written, we hope it can get addressed nevertheless. And then we can, if we have time, we can try and get into some specifics of the questions. But I'm going to take a little bit, just as we start, the prerogative of the chair here, to make one comment. I was talking to Dennis about this. Matt introduced me. I'm a retired professor, and I used to have the George Ladd Chair of New Testament at Fuller. George Ladd was one of the earliest professors at Fuller, perhaps one of the most influential early on, and his early life's work was devoted to writing against dispensationalism. And so a book he wrote that I don't know that it's in print today, our blessed hope, taking off from Titus 2:13, what is our blessed hope? It is not the rapture of the church. It is the return of Christ. And so early on then, Fuller and a number of other so-called evangelical institutions, that word today is a bit problematic, went in a very different direction. So just to make that little footnote about the sort of complicated relationship of fundamentalism, dispensationalism, and evangelicalism. So let me start with a series of questions from the audience here, and from things that you both said, and Tommy, you especially, I think, in talking about the meaning of Israel, and then Dennis, as you addressed it with Israel and the church and so on. And this series of questions has to do with terminology and language. And so I wonder if we could just start by very quickly reminding us of the difference between terms like Israel, Israelite, Israeli, Jewish. Tommy, do you want to do that? Or
Sure.
diaspora, etc.?
I'll take a stab. So, first of all, let me just say before I try to take on these terms that I don't think any of these terms has a super technical and stable definition. Each one of them is a little messy, and I don't think the way forward is to always get the definitions right or something. I think our hope for promoting peace is broader in terms of the patterns of how we talk and how we live, rather than whether or not we always get the definitions right. So with that caveat, Israelite in the Bible, I would say, is broadly the term for anyone belonging to this vast sprawl of people that calls out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their God. Those are Israelites. Perfectly possible to think about Christians as belonging to that group, it seems to me. Israelis are specifically people who are sort of nationalized as part of the modern country of Israel. And this is not exclusively Jews. You have Israeli Palestinians, for example, Israeli Arabs. 22% of the citizens of the modern state of Israel are Arab Palestinians living in the part of the land that's now been defined by borders as Israel. Hebrew is a name that we get for the people early on, especially before the Exodus in the Bible, that relates especially to language. It's similar to what Arab is supposed to mean today. Arab people are people that speak Arabic. It's not people belonging to this or that country. It's not that they're Muslim. You have Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, etc. Hebrew would have been similar. Hebrew as a way of talking about a community of people according to the language that they speak. And so the people that come from Canaan down into Egypt during famine are Hebrew people, and then they're known as the Hebrew people as they begin their exodus later on. Which one have I missed?
Talk a little bit about the meaning of Palestine.
Okay, and then I didn't say anything about Jew. Palestine actually has some roots, I think, with Philistia in the Bible. It's a term that's actually a Latin Roman term that emerges in the 2nd century for a part of land that is a province of the Roman Empire at that point, especially part of Syria. So Palestinian is a term that would not have been current in Jesus' day to describe people, and it became a way of talking about people living in that land in subsequent generations. Could have described Jews at various points if the Romans were the ones doing the describing. And so today, of course, in our context, it's become a way of talking about people whose presence in the land seems to go back generations, even before the arrival of Jews en masse and the foundation of the state of Israel. But for that reason, it would be possible to talk about Palestinian Jews, for example. So there's a lot of ways these words upset the usual categories of division that we've inherited. Jew is an interesting term because we don't find any use of the term Jew in super ancient Israel. It seems to emerge after the exile. This would be the Babylonian invasion, 6th century BC. The remnant of the kingdom of Judah is dispersed, and while they are dispersed, they come to be known as Jews. So we get this term in Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther, this literature that's from that period of the dispersion after exile, and then it sticks as people that are known as Jews as we read about them in the New Testament, even though Marianne could speak more eloquently about this than I. What even that term means in the New Testament is very shifty, you know?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John, which included an excursus on the meaning of the word Jew in the Gospel of John, which occurs quite frequently. And I sent it to Tommy, my good colleague, who wrote like 15 or 20 pages back to me about why I should see things differently. So I decided I would. That is, see things differently. Was Jesus a Palestinian? Was Jesus a Palestinian Jew? That is sometimes said today. When I was in Israel, I heard that. Does that make sense? You've sort of suggested, well, it wouldn't have been the language used then. It's another way to ask it, what was this territory called in the Bible, and what should we name it today? Either one of you.
Why don't you start, Dennis?
Well, I mean, it's called Palestine today.
It's called Palestine, yeah.
Although even that is, and by the way, I just wanted to say, well, some of you don't know this article, you should read it if you can, but your article on Israel as a term of theological art, I think, is a nice way of summarizing what you were saying about the use of the word Israel.
And where is that article?
I don't think it's published.
Oh, okay.
I should do that.
Okay.
The thing
If you
is
would
that I
like
haven't gotten
Tommy's
around
piece
to.
on Israel,
One of his
Yeah, I'll just send it to you by email.
One of his doctoral students, it was one of mine, gave it to me, but it's a
Okay.
good art.
Yeah.
I like it. So,
Yeah.
well, let me put it this way. Our friend, the guest we had for a year, Johanna Catanaccio, living with us, graduated at Wheaton with his master's degree, and was upset when they put in the announcements of the graduate's hometown, Jerusalem, Israel.
yeah,
Because for him, it's Jerusalem, Palestine.
yeah.
So even that kind of terminology
Yeah.
with people from more of an Arab background. And in fact, he got very upset when they had a chapel, when they had all the international students come down with their flag, and they gave him the Israeli flag. And he refused to, he just threw it down. He also gave his diploma back to Wheaton. But anyway, but because it listed the homeland there. So I think even that is kind of wishy-washy, you know, because is it Palestine or is it Israel? And in a sense, today it's the same land.
I hope that today, in the way that we talk about what Palestinian people are enduring, that it would come through the ways that Jesus shared in the plight of people like that. So there's some definite affinity between the Palestinian experience and the experience of Jesus in that same land in his own generation. And that's a way in which I'd say talking about Jesus as a Palestinian might resonate truthfully. There's just more that also has to be said depending on who you're trying to talk to and what you're trying to say. One other thing about place names, when I was in Jerusalem, I was in this interesting think tank of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars all in one place in Jerusalem for a while. And visiting some of the Arab Palestinian villages, I heard complaints from them about how they couldn't use Google Maps because Google had effectively allowed the government of Israel to control the names of places. So they couldn't recognize their own places by using this very common app that everybody was using to navigate the land. So there's a lot of politics that are at stake in how we use names. And I think that as Christians, we would be wise generally to try to honor the way that local people who are being mistreated have known their places over generations, and not to erase that by appealing to names of the Bible for it. So it's very customary in Israel to talk about all kinds of lands as Judea and Samaria, even though none of the people that live there know their land in those terms. So to impose something we think comes from the Bible in a way that erases those people and how they know their own places, I think is a mistake.
Yeah. And it is interesting that, Hannah was born and reared in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just want to, because I mean, we're on the same page here in the sense that our Christian brothers and sisters, that's who they are. And it took him 6 years to graduate from a 4-year college because the school kept being shut down by the Israeli government. And he was stopped once as a TA with papers in his pocket from students that he was to grade, and Israeli soldiers stopped him at gunpoint, thinking that he had some sort of weapon there. So,
Yeah.
so I just, and of course we should feel pain for what, happened on October 7th to Israel. But at the same time, I'm pained that my Christian brothers and sisters don't remember that they have also Christian brothers and sisters there.
So this leads into the next, we've dealt with, there's more we could talk about here, but I want to lead into this next set of questions, and you've talked about a here and then at the same time, and in a sense I think these questions are asking about those two realities of what's going on right now in Israel. And basically they have to do with this question. You often hear this in the news, the U.S. government says this, the Israeli government says this, that Israel has a right to exist. At the same time, Israel, there are many of Israel's neighbors whose expressed goal or desire is to see the elimination of Israel. In other words, it does not have a right to exist. So I'd like us to do two things. One, talk about biblically and what does it mean to say Israel has a right to exist, and do you think that's true? And then at the same time, how do we talk about this in light of the fact, I was saying at the break, and some of you who have been in the land of Israel will have maybe been to this place. We were at Tel Dan up in the north, and if you go up there and stand at a certain place, you can see Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, maybe with the exception of Jordan, who don't really wish Israel well. Israel's a very small country. It's got a lot of power, but it's very small geographically. And yet, you cross the wall and go into the Palestinian territories, land, and you see the need to collect water because they get almost no water from it, and so they have tanks on their roofs to get that little bit of water they can get. The checkpoint itself that they go through, which they describe as humiliating. The difficulty that their land is across the wall and they can't get to it. Let's talk about Israel's right to exist and Israel's fear, Tommy, which you brought up. How do do these go together? Does the one outweigh the other? Should the U.S. stop using this language of Israel's right to exist? What would you like to say?
It's a weighty question. I worry, of course, that there's always things that are bundled in it. So that if you say that Israel has a right to exist, you've effectively implied all kinds of things that we should not imply. So I would say it this way, hopefully with some humility. I don't think that Israel has a right to exist as a state in any more sense than any of us has some right to exist where we do enfranchised as a state. We could talk more broadly about our right and dignity to exist as human beings, as communities in certain ways, but the structures of the modern state have all kinds of things associated with them that I'm not sure that Christians should be sort of automatically supportive of. So for all that I've said about the need to be responsive to the fear that Israeli Jews, especially, and you've referenced this with their hostile neighbors, and other Jews experience today in the shadow of the Holocaust, I don't think that it's right to allow that fear to authorize a structure of systemic violence and oppression. Just don't think we should allow that. But we do need to advocate for the ability of people to live lives of relative health and peace with their neighbors where they are. And somehow in that tension, I think the Christian witness has got to find a way to express itself. again, I worry about doing that at a distance when we among us might not be willing to face the same scrutiny of our places where we live, for us to be told we don't have certain rights. So we've got to be hopefully mindful of the pressure we're applying on others with what we say about their right to exist as a state, if we're going to say it about others and not ourselves.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, in some sense, the state boundaries are modern and flexible too. But the dispensationalists I was talking about would not want Arabs having anything to do with of all of Israel, Gaza and the West Bank and all of it. And as I said, supporting the settlements, which are against international law anyway. And Netanyahu is against any two-state solution, which would be one way to make peace. This is only my opinion, but I don't think he's ever going to get rid of Hamas. It's an ideology, not just a people, not just, soldiers. So I don't think there's going to be peace there anyway, because two different groups want state. So,
Yeah.
So will we ever? No, I don't think we'll ever solve that. It'll just be tension all the time. So, and not just externally, but internally. So,
One thing maybe to add to this that I didn't get a chance to mention, but I think is relevant. You're talking about the way dispensationalists and other Christians have had a very difficult time thinking about the Arab presence in the land. And what that suggests to me is that there is a kind of racial reality that's going on in the way that Christians, especially white Christians, relate to the geopolitics of the Middle East. Because, in fact, there are Arab Jews.
yeah.
There are Ethiopian Jews. And for some reason, it seems Christians of a certain ilk don't seem to feel any affinity for those kinds of Jews, and have bonded themselves to Jews of a certain European background in whom they see something of themselves. And so I hope that we're examining ourselves about how we might be playing into a certain sort of racial geopolitics with how we talk about Jews, the relationship between Christians in places like the U.S. and Jews in the Middle East. Those matters, I think, are affecting how people imagine those things.
Yeah, I remember the first time I met an Ethiopian Jew. It was in Israel. And it threw me for a loop, because I also had this kind of, idea of what a Jew looks like. So, yeah.
So I hope this won't open too big a can of worms, but and I know this is a very large topic that has to do with interpretation of Scripture and so on. But when we talk about Israel's right to exist and we read biblical stories, we also hear of what is called the conquest of the land. Israel coming out of Egypt, being given a mandate to take the land, and then the dispossession of the Canaanites, the slaughter, the stories of their slaughter and so on. How do we think about that? How do we read those stories, especially in relationship today to a somewhat parallel story of, after 1948 with the civil wars and Israel and the Arabs then making a sort of settlement about who gets what, but Israel, large waves of Jews coming into the land at the time, leading to war. So that's a very compressed way to say it. But what do we think about the conquest and Joshua, which is one of our questions here? And if you want to say that's a topic for another time.
Well, you could come to seminary. Try to talk about that more. It's hard to give a short answer to that. First of all, it's important to note, I think, that in the Bible, Joshua is not the only narrative that we get about how the Israelites came into the land. Deuteronomy tells a little bit of a different story that I think is good to just keep as part of the picture. The fact that God is pictured in Joshua as somehow leading Israel into this conquest of the land, I don't think is presented actually as God giving some categorical authorization of this way of doing things. Later on, God is going to accompany the Chaldeans in doing the exact same thing to the Israelites that God had accompanied the Israelites in doing to the Canaanites. And Habakkuk, of course, is horrified that God has taken the side against the Israelites, God's own people, and sided with the Chaldeans. So the picture of how God is present in the movement of peoples and the conquest of places, I think, is a complex question in the Bible. It's not just a matter of God condoning or authorizing one side against another and giving us some precedent for how we're supposed to engage in the struggles for land in our day. It takes something, I think, more patience of getting at what those stories are telling us. One thing that is, I think, worth mentioning is the picture that we are given of both the displacement of Israelites from the land and the displacement of Canaanites from the land at the hands of Israel is the consequence of how people have lived in that land. So you desecrate the land and the fabric of people living in the land by the way that you live there. You find yourself fragmented, eventually at each other's throats, and driven from the land. And this story is told as a movement of God that doesn't simply stand by while people and land are mistreated forever. Eventually, consequences cause those people to be displaced. So I would try to read Joshua along those lines rather than giving us some precedent that God calls some people to conquer others, gives them some deed like that. You all are probably familiar with the history of the United States drawing on exactly that story in a horrifying way, authorizing white European Christians to eradicate the Canaanites of the land that we find ourselves on. And we're heirs of that history, and we're still, I think, reaping the consequences of it. So we've got to learn to read Joshua better.
Let me ask you, Tommy, about Tremper Longman's a friend, and he
Old Testament scholar.
Yeah, and he was working through this issue in a recent book, and we talked about it as he was getting the book written, and he was just something to this effect, that all of that story is God's way of, in one way or another, guiding Israel toward the coming of, well, what some would argue is the Israel, Jesus Christ. So is there a way of talking about that convoluted story as having that trajectory?
Well, it is significant that Jesus and Joshua are the same name in the Bible. And I do think that the story of Jesus that we get is designed to shed critical light on a previous generation, Joshua specifically, like what that way of taking possession of the land led to. Jesus comes into Jerusalem from Jericho following the same pathway as Joshua. No army, no swords, a very different way of claiming the future and the power to rule God's people. So in that sense, I think that's okay. I just don't want to allow us kind of like way of reading Jesus into the story to explain away the horror of what is actually involved in that dark chapter of Israel's history.
Yeah.
We have a series of questions, and this may take us to the end. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but they were too hard, so I put them at the bottom of the... we're going to call these a group of questions sort of like, what are we supposed to do? How do we live as followers of Jesus? So let me just suggest some of the kinds of sub-questions here that have come up. What important moral issues for American Christians to consider? What practices and dispositions of communities and individuals should we adopt? Someone referred to the Pasadena City Council meeting, which you may be aware of on Monday night, that after lengthy debate adopted a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, but noted that the pain that was expressed in that meeting of people even who live here and the trauma that is being experienced. What if I advocate for a ceasefire or a free Palestine? Does that make me anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish? How do I take seriously the fears of many Jews and Israelis? This is what we've talked about while standing against the oppression of the Palestinian people. What do we do? What practices do we, marches and petitions and so on don't seem to make, we give voice to things, but they don't seem to change much. Do they change us? But if you were to answer this question, to tell someone, what do we do? How do we live? How should we think? Where would you start?
I want to just start where Tommy emphasized with humility, because somebody said when you're pointing one finger, you've got three pointing back. We have a lot of issues we need to deal with perhaps first. We've been watching this new series on the bomb and the Cold War. And when you think of what we've done to other people, we're the only nation that's ever used an atomic bomb on people. And the place we're sitting right now was somebody else's land at one time. And I don't, maybe we need to start with some humility. I don't think people who ask these questions always have the humility to say.
And let me push on that. So we, to put the most cynical face on it, so we sit in this nice land and we lament that it once belonged to someone else, and we go on without a single thing changing in the way we live or what we do.
Well, I think one thing we have to do is what's not happening in some states right now, is recalling our history. People, if you don't remember your own history, then I don't think you're going to have the right answers.
So at least be a place to start.
A place to start is remembering our history. And I was just saying to Tommy, and to you, I think at the break, that a church that our kids go to in Canada, Vancouver, every week remind the congregation whose land this was. And maybe there's just a way to start is our memory of what we've done first, before we can even begin to think about how we should ask other people to act. That's the beginning.
Good beginning. I do think that with what Dennis is saying, there is an urgency to act from our own spheres of influence now in favor of an end to this massive violence being doled out on people in Gaza today. It's important to recognize, despite the distance, that the ties economically, especially between the United States and Israel, are substantial. Yeah. And with that, I think, comes some responsibility for us that other people in other places might not have. And so I do think we should be agitating, frankly, for an end to the destruction of people in Gaza that is ongoing. So I hope that you'll feel called and driven to do that. I think we're all going to need to respond in different ways, so I'm not sure it needs to be uniform. But I wouldn't want our desire to be sort of careful, thoughtful, humble in the way that we approach this to keep us from delivering an urgent call for an end to this kind of destruction. And that happens with our voices, it happens with our bodies, it happens with how we spend money, who we elect into office, how we do that. I think we should employ those means. More broadly, in terms of ongoing practices, I appreciate the question about, if I call for a free Palestine, if I call for a ceasefire, am I anti-Semitic? I don't think we should stand for that sort of, I take it to be a kind of fear-mongering. But it's hard to avoid that charge if you're not spending any time with Jewish people. So we would be wise, it's not like we have to work that hard in Los Angeles, to form some meaningful friendships with Jewish people who, by the way, are often extremely exercised about what is happening in the Middle East. Very slow to authorize this kind of destruction of people. So forming ongoing friendships with people that have more immediate ties to what's happening there, I think, is a crucial Christian practice. They might be able to help us to figure out how do we criticize what Israel is doing as a state today without being anti-Semitic. I'm not sure you can learn that without hanging out with Jewish people who feel the concrete effects of anti-Semitism in their lives. Similarly, with the example Dennis has given, the way that so many of us have no ties no meaningful relationships with Palestinian Christians or Palestinian non-Christians in the land, I think, is a catastrophic mistake. So it does behoove us, I think, to forge meaningful emotional bonds with people that are experiencing the concrete effects, what happens with your and my tax dollars in the Middle East. One quick anecdote there. My dad, dispensationalist, went to Talbot in the 70s, leading the typical sort of Disneyland tour of the Holy Land trips of Christians to Israel. He had an encounter with a Palestinian shop owner in Bethlehem, where all 40 of us on the nice bus after our 5-star breakfast, were in Bethlehem buying something from this Palestinian shop owner's store. And he said, I wonder if you all, since you're Christians like me, which of course was already a shock.
Yeah.
Here's an Arab Christian talking to us. If you might spend some moments here praying for the peace of my city. And I could tell that it shook my dad to have that concrete encounter with a Palestinian Christian person that just messed with his categories. And it was very shortly after that Israel invaded Lebanon. And my dad, megachurch pastor, 30, 40 miles from here, I remember watching him stand up in front of the people after the invasion had begun and say this, years ago I think that I would have called for us to pray for the victory of Israel and yet another threat to its existence in the Middle East. But he said, recent experiences tell me that it might be wiser for us to pray for peace. So just that subtle shift, I think, probably a million other variables, but it was partly prompted by that concrete encounter with a Palestinian person who made a connection that changed my dad's sensibilities about how to respond. So we need to cultivate those kinds of connections as a practice, I think, if we expect to respond more faithfully to the ongoing crisis.
Can I just amplify that too? For instance, when Johanna was with us for a year, Trevecca my wife would have WMBI on the radio, which has got some good stuff on it, but every year, every Friday, they would have the report from Jerusalem. And Johanna finally he went to, I forget the pastor's name of Moody Church at the time, but went and told him, you'd have to change your thinking about some of this because you're not paying any attention to the other side of it. And it helped because the pastor had to be introduced to Johanna in that sense. And on one of our trips to Israel, we also went to Gaza, and when you see how those people lived before it's being demolished, it was no fun either. So I just think the interpersonal Can I just say this too, though? And this will take us off topic probably in a way, but forgive me. But, well, two things. One, I'm going to get in trouble for saying, and the other will take us a little bit farther afield, maybe. But one is, I don't mean that these are moral equivalents. But when I see what's being done in Gaza, I also think of Kristallnacht. And if there's some moral equivalence there in a sense, and I might get in trouble for saying that, but the other thing I wanted to say was, I think sometimes the evil of things that happen, for instance, the evil of what Hitler did to the Jews, had us ignore what Stalin did to his own people. And so in some ways, too, this being so wrapped up in this very important world issue in Israel, Gaza, is having us forget what's happening in other places. We've taught in Sudan 4 times, and what's happening there is horrendous. The famines there and the violence done to people there, and of course Ukraine, what Russia's doing there. So I think there's some of the evil too is our focus on one part of the world leads us to neglect others. So I just want to remind everyone there's other things going on, and we have to be paying attention to those.
Just a quick anecdote, and then we'll have to stop. But we were sharing at the break some stories of all of our various trips to Israel, and one of the things we saw, whether we were in Israel or the West Bank or Gaza, was the actual on the ground, the way Jewish and Palestinians or Jewish and Arabs, whoever they might be, Israeli doctors taking care of children from Gaza in their intensive care units, or Jewish rabbis standing in orchards or olive orchards helping the Palestinians to harvest their crops. You don't hear a lot about those kinds of things, but it does say to us, people are doing things on the ground that are costly, costly and trying to make a difference. It must be overwhelming to try to do that, but nevertheless, the humanity that has continued to exist in the midst of what are just very inhumane conditions.
Arab doctors treating Israeli soldiers.
Arab doctors treating
In the
Israeli
emergency room.
soldiers
Yeah.
and the like. So it's not monolithic. You know, if you talk to Jews, they don't all agree. If you talk to Israelis, they don't all agree. Israeli Jews, they don't all agree. It's just there's any more than all American Christians agree about things. So we hope what you will hear this morning is that you will take away from this some of that hope and courage to follow through on some of our convictions that we've talked about here. Sorry we didn't get to some of the other questions, such as, do we think Trump is anointed by God or the Antichrist? But maybe you can come back. That really is...
We had an answer, but...
I was going to say, we can answer that up front afterwards.
We
if
did
you
have an
want.
answer to that, but we will not deal with that. Thank you for coming, and Tiffany, I think, wants to have them.
Thank you. Thanks, Tiff.
Thank you all so much for sharing your gifts with us. When I was thinking about who we might ask with the EEE committee to come and be a part of this, these were the three names that jumped to mind, and all of us said yes. They are not only incredible scholars, but all of them are incredible pastors who care so deeply for the church. So just one more time, can we say thank you for sharing your gifts with us? It is a huge blessing.